The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek as Marshal Frank Harlan leaned against the weathered post outside his office. His eyes, narrowed against both the glare and constant vigilance, tracked a sleek black carriage as it rolled into town. The vehicle stood out like a raven in a chicken coop, too fancy, too polished for this hardscrabble mining settlement where most folks arrived on horseback or in battered wagons. Frank's right hand instinctively drifted toward the worn grip of his Colt Peacemaker. 25 years enforcing the law had taught him that anything unusual usually meant trouble. The carriage came to a stop outside the Silverado Hotel, the only establishment in Redemption Creek that might be considered respectable by Eastern standards. A driver in a smart black coat hopped down and opened the door with a flourish that seemed almost comical in these surroundings. First emerged a young woman, no, a lady, dressed in a traveling suit of deep burgundy that must have cost more than most miners made in 6 months. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a small matching hat, and even from this distance, Frank could see the rigid determination in her posture. The second figure to exit was a tall man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the unmistakable arrogance of wealth. Frank pushed his hat back slightly, revealing a weathered face marked by years under the western sun, and a scar that ran from his right temple to his jawline, a souvenir from a knife fight in Dodge City years ago. This woman was clearly Margaret Sinclair, the Boston heiress who had inherited her father's controlling interest in the Redemption Creek Mining Company. Her arrival had been announced by telegram 3 days prior, creating a ripple of anxiety among the townsfolk. Nobody quite knew what to expect from the daughter of Calvin Sinclair, the ruthless businessman who had never once visited the mining operation that had made him a fortune. "Marshal, looks like our distinguished visitor has arrived," said Elijah Wheeler, the town's barber and sometimes deputy, who had appeared beside Frank. "Heard she's bringing some fancy mining engineer to look over the operation. Randall over at the mine office is fit to be tied." "I'll wager he is," Frank replied, his voice a gravelly rumble shaped by years of trail dust and whiskey. "Sinclair's man Randall's been running that mine like his own private kingdom since old Calvin took ill. Can't imagine he's happy about the daughter showing up. I hope you're enjoying this story so far. If you're watching this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to know which city you're watching from." The lady and her companion disappeared into the hotel, and Frank pushed himself away from the post. He'd make his introductions later. As the town's law enforcement, it was his duty to know everyone's business, but he preferred to let newcomers settle in before making his presence known. Besides, he had a feeling Miss Sinclair would find her way to his office soon enough. People with that kind of money always managed to find trouble in a place like Redemption Creek, where silver veins in the nearby mountains had brought both prosperity and peril. Frank crossed the street toward the Prairie Rose Saloon, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each deliberate step. Inside, the familiar symphony of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and an out-of-tune piano greeted him. He nodded to Sarah Hawkins, the establishment's proprietor, a handsome woman in her early 40s with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. She had come west as a young widow 15 years ago and built the Prairie Rose from a tent serving rot-gut whiskey into the most successful business in town. "You saw our new arrivals, I take it," Sarah said, sliding a glass of whiskey across the polished bar top without being asked. Their friendship was one of the few constants in Frank's life. "Hard to miss," he replied, taking a small sip of the amber liquid. Unlike most lawmen in frontier towns, Frank was careful with his drinking. Any word on how long Miss Sinclair plans to stay? Sarah shook her head, wisps of honey-blonde hair escaping from her practical updo. Nothing specific, but Jeremiah at the telegraph office mentioned something about her planning to resolve irregularities at the mine. Doesn't sound like a short visit to me. Frank considered this information. The Redemption Creek mine employed over half the men in town and most of the Chinese laborers who lived in their separate settlement on the outskirts. Any disruption there would affect everyone. Irregularities, he repeated thoughtfully. That's a fancy word for trouble. As if summoned by their conversation, the saloon doors swung open and Walter Randall strode in. The mine manager was a barrel-chested man with a florid face and small, calculating eyes. Today, those eyes blazed with barely contained fury. He spotted Frank and made a beeline for the bar, ignoring the other patrons. "Marshal," he growled by way of greeting, "I suppose you've heard about our visitor from Boston." Frank nodded, maintaining his impassive expression. "Word travels fast in Redemption Creek. Something troubling you about Miss Sinclair's arrival?" Randall signaled for a drink, which Sarah provided with professional detachment. "Troubling me? Why should it trouble me that a woman with no experience, no understanding of mining operations, has come to interfere with a business that's been running smoothly for years?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. Her father at least had the good sense to stay in Boston and let men who know what they're doing handle things out here. "I reckon Miss Sinclair has her reasons for making such a long journey," Frank replied mildly, though he was studying Randall closely. The man's reaction seemed excessive, even accounting for his well-known pride. "Reasons?" Randall scoffed, downing his whiskey in one gulp. "She's been filling her head with nonsense, listening to complaints from troublemakers and malcontents." He leaned closer to Frank, lowering his voice. "Mark my words, Marshal. That woman is going to destroy everything her father built, and she'll take this town down with it." Before Frank could respond, the saloon doors opened again. This time, it was Jeremiah from the telegraph office, looking flustered as he scanned the room. When he spotted Frank, relief washed over his face. "Marshal Harlan, there you are. There's a lady at your office looking for you. Says it's urgent." Frank exchanged a glance with Sarah, who raised an eyebrow. "Appears Miss Sinclair isn't wasting any time," he said, finishing his whiskey and placing the glass on the bar. To Randall, he added, "Might be best to give the lady a fair hearing before judging her intentions." Randall's only response was a dismissive grunt as Frank made his way out of the saloon and back into the late afternoon sunlight. Across the street, a slender figure in burgundy stood on the porch of his office, her posture suggesting impatience. Frank crossed to meet her, taking his time, observing her more carefully as he approached. Up close, Margaret Sinclair was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps no more than 25. Her complexion was fair, hinting at a life spent indoors rather than under the harsh western sun. But her hazel eyes were sharp and assessing as they tracked his approach. There was a quiet strength in her gaze that reminded him of the pioneer women he'd known, those who had survived the brutal journey west and the even more brutal realities of frontier life. "Miss Sinclair," he said, tipping his hat politely as he reached the porch. "Frank Harlan, Town Marshal. I understand you've been looking for me." "Marshal Harlan," she replied with a crisp Eastern accent. "Thank you for coming promptly. I believe we have matters of some importance to discuss." She glanced meaningfully at the office door. Frank nodded and moved past her to unlock it. The marshal's office was a simple affair: a desk and chair, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, a gun rack on the wall, and 2 cells in the back with iron bars. It wasn't designed to impress visitors from Boston, but it served its purpose. "Please, have a seat," he offered, indicating the chair across from his desk as he settled into his own. "How may I be of assistance to you?" Margaret Sinclair perched on the edge of the chair, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. "Marshall, I'll come straight to the point. I have reason to believe there are serious improprieties occurring at the Redemption Creek mine, and I have come personally to investigate them." Frank kept his expression neutral, though her directness was refreshing. "What sort of improprieties, if I might ask?" "Financial discrepancies, first and foremost. The mine's reported production and its profit margins don't align with the company's receipts." Her voice was steady, businesslike. "But more concerning are the reports I've received about unsafe working conditions, mistreatment of laborers, and possible bribery of government inspectors." This was more serious than Frank had anticipated. "Those are significant allegations, Miss Sinclair. May I ask what evidence you have?" A flash of annoyance crossed her face. "I have financial records showing discrepancies. As for the rest, I have correspondence from several former employees, including one of your own townspeople, a Mr. James Sullivan, who worked as a foreman until last year." Frank nodded slowly. He remembered Sullivan, a good man who had abruptly left town after an accident in the mine had left 3 men dead. The official story was that Sullivan had been negligent, but he had vehemently denied it before departing. "And how do I factor into your investigation?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Margaret's eyes met his directly. "I need protection, Marshall Harlan. Someone I can trust, who knows this town and its people. My presence here is not welcomed by Mr. Randall, and I anticipate he will do everything in his power to obstruct my investigation. Furthermore," she hesitated for the first time, "I have received threats." Frank's expression sharpened. "What kind of threats?" "Letters sent to my home in Boston, warning me not to involve myself in the mine's operations. The last one arrived the day before I departed." She reached into a small handbag and withdrew a folded paper, which she placed on the desk between them. Frank unfolded it carefully. The message was short and explicit. "The West is no place for a woman asking questions. Stay in Boston if you value your life." The letters had been cut from newspapers and pasted onto the paper, a common trick to avoid handwriting identification. "Have you shared this with anyone else?" he asked, refolding the letter. She shook her head. "Only my associate, Mr. Edward Collins, the gentleman who accompanied me. He's a mining engineer who will be evaluating the technical aspects of the operation." Frank leaned back in his chair, considering. He had no love for Walter Randall, who had always treated the town's law enforcement as his personal servants. Moreover, if there was truth to Miss Sinclair's accusations about unsafe conditions, that was something Frank couldn't ignore. His younger brother had died in a mining collapse in Colorado years ago, the result of a company cutting corners on support timbers. "What exactly are you asking of me, Miss Sinclair?" he inquired. Though he already knew, "I would like to hire you as my personal protection during my stay in Redemption Creek," she replied without hesitation. "You would be well compensated, of course, and I believe your position as marshal gives you access to places and people that might be useful to my investigation." Frank studied her thoughtfully. Taking on this role would put him directly at odds with Randall, who had considerable influence with some members of the town council. It could complicate his position as marshal. On the other hand, if there was corruption or dangerous negligence at the mine, it was his duty to address it. I have responsibilities to this town, Miss Sinclair. I can't simply abandon them to become your private guard." "I understand that," she replied. "I'm not asking you to neglect your duties. Rather, I'm suggesting that our interests may align. If there is corruption at the mine, surely that falls under your jurisdiction as an enforcer of the law." She was sharp. He'd give her that. Frank stood and moved to the window, looking out at the town he'd sworn to protect. Redemption Creek had grown from a handful of tents to a proper settlement during his tenure as marshal. He'd seen it through epidemics, claim jumpers, and the constant tensions that arose when men lived too close together with gold fever in their blood. "I'll help you, Miss Sinclair," he said finally, turning back to face her. "But I want to be clear. My first priority is the safety and well-being of this town. If your investigation threatens that, we'll have a problem." Relief flickered across her features before her composure returned. "That's fair, Marshal. I assure you, my goal is to ensure the mine operates safely and honestly, which I believe will benefit everyone in Redemption Creek." Frank nodded, hoping she was right. "When do you plan to begin your inspection of the mine?" "Tomorrow morning, Mr. Collins and I will conduct an initial tour with Mr. Randall, who has reluctantly agreed to facilitate. I'd like you to accompany us." "I'll meet you at your hotel at 8, Frank agreed. "And Miss Sinclair, a word of advice. Trust no one in this town until you're certain they can be trusted. Not everyone who smiles at you wishes you well." She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts. "I'm not as naive as I may appear, Marshal Harlan. My father built his fortune in a world of men who underestimated him at their peril. I've learned from his example." She extended her hand, a surprisingly forward gesture for a lady of her standing. "Thank you for your assistance." Frank took her hand briefly, noting the firmness of her grip despite the delicate size of her gloved fingers. "Miss Sinclair," he acknowledged with a slight bow of his head. After she departed, Frank remained at the window, watching her make her way back to the hotel. The sun was setting now, painting the dusty street and weathered buildings with a golden light that momentarily transformed Redemption Creek into something almost beautiful. But Frank knew better than most that beauty often concealed danger in this unforgiving land. He had just agreed to protect a woman who was walking into a hornet's nest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that before Margaret Sinclair's investigation was complete, blood would be spilled on the streets of his town. The morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of pristine western day that made even Redemption Creek look full of promise. Frank had risen before sunrise, a habit formed during his years as an Army scout before he pinned on a badge. He'd made a circuit of the town, noting the miners heading to the morning shift and the Chinese workers already busy preparing the day's meals in the small settlement they maintained on the eastern edge of town. By the time he arrived at the Silverado Hotel, the sun had crested the mountains, illuminating the freshly painted sign that proudly proclaimed the establishment as the finest accommodations west of Denver, a claim that would have provoked hearty laughter from anyone who had actually been to Denver. Still, for Redemption Creek, the Silverado represented luxury, with its real glass windows and actual beds instead of straw pallets. Margaret Sinclair was waiting in the small lobby, conversing quietly with Edward Collins, the mining engineer. They made an incongruous pair in this frontier setting. She in a practical but clearly expensive traveling suit of forest green, he in a three-piece suit that must have been sweltering even in the morning coolness. Both looked up as Frank entered, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. "Marshal Harlan?" Margaret greeted him with a nod. "Thank you for your punctuality. May I formally introduce Mr. Edward Collins, our mining engineer and geologist from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology." Collins stepped forward, extending his hand. He was younger than Frank had initially thought, probably in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard that failed to disguise his youth. "Marshall, a pleasure. Miss Sinclair has spoken highly of your willingness to assist us." Frank shook the offered hand, noting the firmness of the grip despite the smooth skin that suggested Collins was more accustomed to books than physical labor. "Mr. Collins, I trust you both slept well, despite the noise. The Silver Dollar Saloon across the street tends to be lively until the early hours." A ghost of a smile touched Margaret's lips. "I've found that exhaustion after days of travel is an excellent remedy for noise, Marshall. Shall we proceed? Mr. Randall is expecting us at 8:30, and I prefer not to give him the satisfaction of our tardiness." The trio stepped out into the morning sunlight, Margaret and Collins blinking slightly against the brightness. Frank noticed several miners on their way to work slow their pace to stare at the unusual sight: a fine lady and a city gentleman accompanied by the town marshal, heading in the direction of the mine offices. The mine employs nearly 400 men, Frank explained as they walked, feeling it was his duty to provide context. Most live in town or in the company housing just beyond the processing facilities. The Chinese workers have their own settlement, about 60 men who handle the cooking, laundry, and some of the surface operations. "And the mine itself?" Collins inquired, his interest clearly professional. "I've reviewed some of the reports, but they're notably lacking in detail. 5 main shafts now, though they started with just the one that old Jeremiah Redemption discovered back in '67. That's how the town got its name. Silver mostly, though there's some copper mixed in. The deepest shaft goes down about 800 feet, from what I understand." Collins nodded thoughtfully. "And the extraction method? Blasting, I presume?" "Dynamite, yes, 3 times daily. Dawn, noon, and dusk. You get used to the rumble after a while." Frank gestured ahead to where a large wooden building stood at the base of a steep hillside, pockmarked with adits and ventilation shafts. "That's the main office. The processing works are behind it, and the shaft entrances are up the slope." As they approached, Frank noticed Walter Randall watching their progress from the office porch, his expression reminiscent of a man who had just bitten into something sour. Behind him stood 2 men that Frank recognized as mine supervisors, both wearing expressions of similar displeasure. "Miss Sinclair," Randall called out as they neared, making a poor show of cordiality. "You're early. We weren't expecting you for another 15 minutes." "I believe in making the most of each day, Mr. Randall," Margaret replied coolly. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Edward Collins, our geological expert who will be evaluating the operation. And you know Marshall Harlan, of course." Randall's gaze shifted to Frank, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Marshall, I wasn't aware law enforcement was required for a routine inspection." Frank met the mine manager's stare evenly. "Miss Sinclair requested my presence in an advisory capacity, given my familiarity with the area." "Indeed," Margaret interjected smoothly. "The marshal's local knowledge will be invaluable. Now, shall we begin? I'd like to review the production reports for the past year before we tour the actual mining operation." For a moment, it seemed Randall might object, but he simply gave a curt nod and turned, leading them into the office. The interior was surprisingly well appointed, with solid wooden desks, filing cabinets, and even a telegraph operator in the corner, a direct line to the company headquarters in Denver, Frank presumed. "You can use the conference room," Randall said, indicating a door to the right. "I've had Jenkins pull the records you requested, though I must say, The volume of documentation you've demanded is excessive and disruptive to our operations." Margaret's expression remained pleasantly neutral, though Frank noted a hardening in her eyes. "I appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Randall. I assure you, thoroughness now will save time later." The conference room contained a large table stacked with leather-bound ledgers and stacks of papers. Collins immediately gravitated toward them, his fingers practically twitching with eagerness to begin his examination. Margaret, however, turned to Randall with a direct gaze. "I'd like to begin by understanding the safety protocols you have in place, Mr. Randall. There have been several incidents in the past year, 3 fatalities in November, if I recall correctly." Randall's face flushed slightly. "Mining is dangerous work, Miss Sinclair. We take every reasonable precaution, but accidents happen. Those men knew the risks when they signed on." Frank watched the exchange silently, noting the way Margaret's spine stiffened almost imperceptibly at Randall's dismissive tone. "Every reasonable precaution," she repeated. "Including proper timbering of new tunnels? Because the report I received suggested the collapse that killed those men occurred in a section that had been inadequately supported." "That report was filed by James Sullivan." Randall spat the name with visible contempt. "A man who was dismissed for incompetence and has been trying to shift blame ever since. I'm disappointed that you would give credence to the accusations of a disgruntled former employee." "I give credence to evidence, Mr. Randall, not accusations," Margaret replied evenly. "Which is why I'm here, to evaluate that evidence personally. Now, I believe Mr. Collins would like to begin reviewing these financial records while you and I, accompanied by Marshal Harlan, tour the actual mining operation." Randall's mouth tightened, but he nodded curtly. "As you wish, though I still don't understand the need for the Marshal's presence." Frank stepped forward slightly. "Consider me an impartial observer, Mr. Randall. I'm sure you have nothing to hide." The mine manager's eyes flashed with anger, but he quickly masked it. "Of course not. This way, please." As they left Collins to his examination of the records, Frank caught Margaret's eye and gave her a slight nod of approval. She had handled Randall's hostility with composure and authority. Not an easy feat for a woman in this man's world of the West. But Frank knew they were just getting started, and Randall wasn't a man who took challenges to his authority lightly. The tour of the mining operation began with the processing works, where the raw ore was crushed and the valuable minerals separated from worthless rock. The noise was deafening, massive stamp mills pounding day and night, reducing stone to powder. Chinese workers, their faces covered with cloths against the constant dust, moved efficiently among the machinery, while white supervisors shouted orders that were barely audible above the din. Frank noticed Margaret observing everything with careful attention, occasionally making notes in a small book she carried. He also noted how the supervisors straightened up when they saw Randall approaching with visitors, hastily directing workers to clear debris or adjust their protective gear, actions that suggested these precautions weren't standard practice. From the processing works, they proceeded up the steep path to the mine entrances. Here, the air was thick with tension as shifts changed. Weary men with dust-streaked faces emerging from the earth, while others prepared to descend into the darkness. Frank saw recognition in the eyes of several miners as they spotted him accompanying the boss and the unknown woman. Word would spread quickly. "This is the entrance to Shaft 3, our newest and most productive," Randall explained, gesturing to a timbered opening in the hillside. "We're averaging nearly 40 tons of ore daily from this shaft alone." Margaret approached the entrance, peering into the darkness. "And the ventilation system?" I understand carbon monoxide from blasting is a significant hazard. We have air shafts at regular intervals, Randall replied, a hint of impatience in his voice. And we clear the tunnels for at least 30 minutes after each blast before allowing men back in. 30 minutes? Margaret's eyebrow raised slightly. The mining safety guidelines published last year by the Bureau of Mines recommend a minimum of 45 minutes. Randall's expression darkened. Those guidelines were written by men who've never had to meet a production quota, Miss Sinclair. 30 minutes has proven adequate. Has it? She asked quietly. Or have you simply been fortunate? Before Randall could respond, a commotion erupted from the shaft entrance. 2 miners emerged, supporting a third between them, whose leg was wrapped in a makeshift bandage already soaked through with blood. The injured man's face was contorted in pain. What happened? Frank demanded, stepping forward as the miners lowered their companion to the ground. Support beam gave way, one of the men explained, his breath coming in gasps from the exertion. Caught Matthew's leg before we could pull him clear. Needs a doctor. Quick. Frank knelt beside the injured miner, examining the wound. The leg wasn't crushed, which was fortunate, but the gash was deep and would require stitching. I'll take him to Doc Wilson, he said, already calculating how to transport the man down the steep path to town. That won't be necessary. Randall interjected coldly. We have a company medic who handles these matters. Margaret stepped forward, her expression resolute. This man needs proper medical attention, Mr. Randall, not first aid. Miss Sinclair, with all due respect, this is a routine mining injury. We handle dozens like it every month. The company has procedures. The procedures appear to be failing, Mr. Randall, she interrupted, her voice sharp. First a collapse, now an unstable support beam. These are not coincidences. They're patterns of negligence. Frank watched Randall's face flush with anger, a vein pulsing at his temple. For a moment, he thought the mine manager might physically lash out, and he subtly shifted his position to place himself between Randall and Margaret. You've been here less than a day, Randall seethed through clenched teeth. You know nothing about mining operations or the realities of this work. Your father understood that management from Boston only interferes with practical necessities on the ground. Margaret met his gaze unflinchingly. My father is dead, Mr. Randall, and while he was alive, he trusted you to run this operation honestly and safely. I'm no longer certain that trust was well placed. A tense silence fell, broken only by the pained breathing of the injured miner. Finally, Frank spoke. I'm taking this man to Doc Wilson. Miss Sinclair, I suggest you return to the office and continue your inspection of the records with Mr. Collins. We can resume the tour tomorrow. Margaret nodded, clearly recognizing the wisdom of a strategic retreat. Agreed, Marshal. Mr. Randall, I believe we've seen enough for today. I'll expect a full incident report regarding this injury on my desk by tomorrow morning. Without waiting for Randall's response, she turned and began making her way back down the path toward the mine offices. Frank gestured to the 2 miners who had brought out their injured companion. Help me get him down to my horse. I'll take him to town. As the miners carefully lifted their friend, Frank glanced at Randall, who stood rigidly watching Margaret's departing figure. The hatred in the man's eyes was unmistakable, and Frank made a mental note to keep an even closer watch on Miss Sinclair. She had just made a dangerous enemy, and Frank suspected Walter Randall wasn't a man who fought fair. The doctor's office was a modest clapboard building on a side street, marked only by a simple wooden sign declaring Elias Wilson, M.D. Inside, it smelled of carbolic acid and herbal tinctures, a combination Frank had come to associate with both healing and suffering during his years on the frontier. Doc Wilson, a grizzled veteran of the Civil War who had come west to escape its memories, took one look at the injured miner and immediately cleared his examination table. "Another mine accident?" he asked, though it was clearly rhetorical, as he began cutting away the bloody pant leg. "Support beam failure," Frank confirmed, helping position the miner on the table. "Matthew Reeves, isn't it?" Wilson asked the injured man, who nodded through gritted teeth. "Well, Mr. Reeves, you're going to need some stitches, but you'll keep the leg. You're luckier than some I've seen from that mine." As the doctor worked, cleansing the wound with a solution that made Reeves hiss in pain, Frank stood by the window, looking out at the town. From here, he could see the Silverado Hotel, where Margaret Sinclair was likely reviewing her findings with Collins. He couldn't shake a growing sense of unease about the situation. "That's the third serious injury from a structural failure in 2 months," Wilson commented as he prepared his suturing needle. "Not counting the men who died in the collapse last year. Something's not right up there, Frank." Frank nodded slowly. "Miss Sinclair seems to think so too." Wilson glanced up, his bushy eyebrows rising in surprise. "The owner's daughter? You've spoken with her?" "More than spoken. She's hired me as protection while she investigates the operation. She believes Randall is cutting corners on safety and possibly skimming profits." The doctor snorted as he began stitching the wound. "I could have told her that without her making the journey from Boston. Every miner in town knows Randall values production over precaution. But knowing it and proving it are different matters. That's what she's trying to do. Prove it," Frank replied, turning from the window. "And Randall's not taking kindly to the scrutiny." "I don't imagine he would." Wilson tied off a stitch with practiced efficiency. A man like that, used to operating without oversight for years, suddenly facing accountability. "He'll fight dirty, mark my words." Frank's hand unconsciously moved to rest on his gun. "I'm counting on it. That's why she hired me." Later that afternoon, Frank made his way to the Silverado Hotel to check on Margaret. The desk clerk, a pinch-faced man who clearly considered himself above his surroundings, initially tried to deny him access to Miss Sinclair's room, but wilted quickly under Frank's steady gaze. "Second floor, end of the hall," the clerk muttered. "But she has a gentleman caller already, that mining fellow." Frank found the door easily enough and knocked firmly. After a moment, it opened to reveal Edward Collins, his jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, and hair slightly disheveled from what appeared to be hours of intense work. "Marshall," he greeted, stepping back to allow Frank entry. "We were just reviewing the production records from the past 18 months. The discrepancies are significant." The room had been transformed into a makeshift office, with papers and ledgers covering every surface. Margaret sat at a small writing desk, hair pinned up more simply than before, a smudge of ink on one cheek giving her a curiously vulnerable appearance despite her businesslike demeanor. "Marshall Harlan," she said, rising to greet him. "How is the injured miner?" "He'll recover," Frank replied. Doc Wilson stitched him up. He should be able to return to work in a week or so, though not underground for a while. Margaret nodded, relief visible in her expression. "That's good news, at least. Mr. Collins and I have been making some rather disturbing discoveries." She gestured to the papers spread across the bed. "Would you care to see what we found?" Frank moved closer, examining the documents. Most were columns of figures that meant little to him, but Collins quickly pointed out the relevant sections. "The mine has been consistently reporting lower production volumes to the company headquarters than what they're actually extracting," the engineer explained. "Based on these processing records compared to the shipping manifests, I estimate they're underreporting by nearly 20%. And where is the unreported silver going? Frank asked, though he suspected he already knew. Margaret's expression was grim. We believe Mr. Randall and perhaps some of the other senior managers are diverting it. There's a smaller processing facility about 10 miles south of here, listed in the company records as abandoned 3 years ago. But the supply requisitions show they're still ordering equipment and materials for it. A shadow operation, Frank mused, processing the stolen ore and selling it independently. That would explain Randall's new house in Denver and the frequent trips he takes there. Exactly, Margaret confirmed. And there's more. The safety violations, they're not just negligence. They're deliberate cost-cutting measures. The company allocates funds for proper timbering, ventilation, and safety equipment. But the actual expenditures are far below what's budgeted. The difference is likely part of their profit scheme. Frank's jaw tightened. Men had died because of this greed. Good men with families. This is more than company business now. It's criminal. Theft on this scale, criminal negligence leading to death, these are matters for the law. Which is precisely why I needed you involved, Marshall. Margaret said earnestly. I suspected financial impropriety, but I never imagined they would deliberately endanger lives for profit. What we've discovered goes beyond my authority as a company representative. This requires legal action. Collins cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. There's another complication. Based on some correspondence we found, it appears Randall has been paying bribes to the territorial mine inspector to overlook the safety violations, and possibly to the local judge as well. Frank wasn't entirely surprised. Judge Hollister had always struck him as a man whose principles were flexible when properly lubricated with cash. That makes things more difficult, but not impossible. We'll need to take this to the federal marshal in Denver. But first, we need irrefutable proof, documents that directly link Randall to both the theft and the safety violations. And we need to inspect that supposedly abandoned processing facility, Collins added. If they're operating it secretly, that would be the smoking gun. Margaret nodded decisively. Then that's our next step. We'll arrange to visit this secondary facility tomorrow. Not we, Frank corrected firmly. Me. If Randall suspects what you've discovered, that facility will be the most dangerous place in the territory for you. I'll go alone and document what I find. Absolutely not, Margaret countered, her chin lifting in a way that reminded Frank she was, after all, a woman accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. This is my company, Marshal Harlan. I have a responsibility to see this through personally. Frank recognized the determination in her eyes, the same look he'd seen in pioneers facing mountain passes in winter, in mothers protecting children from danger, in men standing their ground against impossible odds. It was the look of someone who would not be swayed by appeals to caution. Then we compromise, he said after a moment. I'll go first, scout the location, ensure it's safe. Then you and Collins can follow with the documentation we need to make the case. But you'll follow my instructions without question once we're there. Agreed? Margaret studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Agreed. But we move quickly. Every day we delay is another day the miners are at risk. First light tomorrow, Frank confirmed. Pack only what's essential. It'll be a hard ride. As he left the hotel, the setting sun painted Redemption Creek in hues of gold and shadow. The saloons were coming to life. Piano music drifting into the street, along with the sound of laughter and the occasional raised voice. Ordinary sounds of a mining town evening, but tonight they seemed overlaid. Frank made his way to the telegraph office, where he composed a carefully worded message to the federal marshal in Denver, explaining that he had evidence of significant criminal activity at the Redemption Creek mine and requesting backup. He deliberately kept the details vague. Telegraph operators were notorious gossips, and he couldn't risk word getting back to Randall before they had secured the evidence. As he stepped back onto the street, Frank spotted two of Randall's men watching him from across the way. They made no attempt to hide their surveillance, which in itself was a message. The confrontation that had been brewing since Margaret Sinclair's arrival was approaching its boiling point. Frank touched the worn grip of his Colt reflexively. He had faced down claim jumpers, rustlers, and renegade Comanche in his time. Walter Randall and his corrupt operation didn't frighten him. What concerned him was keeping Margaret safe while they gathered the evidence needed to bring Randall to justice. He hadn't planned on becoming so personally invested in her crusade. His agreement to provide protection had been professional, motivated by his duty to uphold the law and his sympathy for the miners at risk. But there was something about Margaret Sinclair's courage and determination that stirred feelings he'd thought long buried. Admiration, certainly, but also a protective instinct that went beyond his role as marshal. Frank pushed these thoughts aside as he made his way to his small cabin at the edge of town. Tomorrow would bring danger, and he needed to be focused solely on the task at hand. Margaret Sinclair had hired him for her safety, not his feelings. The fact that his heart seemed increasingly in peril around her was a complication he couldn't afford to indulge. The abandoned processing facility was nestled in a narrow canyon about 10 miles south of Redemption Creek, accessible only by a winding trail that showed signs of recent use despite its supposedly deserted status. Frank, Margaret, and Collins had left town before dawn, taking a circuitous route to avoid being followed by Randall's men. Now, as the morning sun rose higher, they crouched on a ridge overlooking the site. "Not very abandoned, is it?" Frank observed, passing his field glasses to Margaret. Through the glasses, she could clearly see activity below. Smoke rising from the smelter chimney, wagons being loaded with what appeared to be refined silver ingots, and armed men patrolling the perimeter. "This is outrageous," she whispered, her voice tight with anger. "They're not even attempting to hide the operation. How has this continued undetected for so long?" "Remote location, paid-off officials, and the fact that most folks mind their own business out here," Frank replied. "Plus, I'd wager those armed men aren't just for show. Anyone who stumbled across this place probably didn't live to tell about it." Collins, who had been examining a folded company map, looked up with concern. "According to this, the company believes this facility was dismantled and the equipment salvaged years ago. They've been operating completely off the books." Frank nodded grimly. "Which means everything here is evidence of theft and fraud. We need to document as much as possible. The operation itself, any paperwork showing shipments or sales, and ideally, something directly connecting Randall to all of it." "How do you suggest we proceed?" Margaret asked, her earlier insistence on taking charge now tempered by recognition of Frank's expertise in these matters. Frank studied the layout of the facility. "There's an office building on the east side. That's likely where any documentation would be kept. The challenge will be getting to it unnoticed." He glanced at the sky. "We wait until noon. That's when they'll break for the midday meal. The yard should clear out somewhat, giving us better odds." The next few hours passed slowly as they maintained their observation from the ridge. The operation below was clearly productive, with workers processing ore and preparing shipments with practiced efficiency. Frank noted with interest that all the workers appeared to be white men. No Chinese laborers as there were at the main mine. Fewer witnesses to silence, he supposed. As noon approached, activity in the yard began to diminish as predicted. Workers made their way to a cookhouse on the western edge of the complex, leaving only a few guards patrolling the perimeter. "Now's our chance," Frank said, checking his Colt one last time. "Collins, you stay here with the horses. If anything goes wrong, ride for Denver and get that evidence to the federal marshal." He handed the engineer the packet of documents they had already gathered from the mine office. Collins nodded, though he looked unhappy about being left behind. "Be careful," he said, his gaze lingering on Margaret with what Frank recognized as more than professional concern. "Stay low and move only when I signal," Frank instructed Margaret, as they began making their way down from the ridge, using the sparse vegetation for cover. "If I tell you to run, you run. No questions, no arguments." To her credit, Margaret followed his instructions perfectly as they made their stealthy approach. Her eastern two guards remained in the yard, one near the main entrance to the facility and another patrolling between the smelter and the storage sheds. "We need a distraction," Frank murmured, assessing the situation. Margaret reached into her pocket and produced a small Derringer, a lady's gun, but deadly enough at close range. "I came prepared, Marshal." Frank raised an eyebrow, but nodded in approval. "Good thinking, but let's hope it doesn't come to that. I have another idea." He picked up a fist-sized rock and pointed to an empty ore cart on the far side of the yard. "When I throw this, it should make enough noise to draw their attention. We'll move to the office while they're investigating." With practiced precision, Frank hurled the rock across the yard. It landed in the metal ore cart with a resounding clang that echoed through the canyon. Instantly, both guards turned toward the sound, one drawing his weapon as they moved to investigate. "Now," Frank whispered, and they darted across the open ground to the office building. The door was locked, but a quick examination showed the window was unlatched. Frank eased it open, helped Margaret through, then followed, closing it behind them, just as the guards determined the noise had been a false alarm. The office was small but orderly, with a desk, filing cabinet, and a wall-mounted safe. Margaret immediately moved to the desk, rifling through the papers there while Frank tackled the filing cabinet. "Shipping manifests," Margaret whispered excitedly after a few moments. "Dating back 3 years, all for silver processed here and sold to buyers in California and Mexico. None of these shipments were ever reported to the company." Frank had found something even more damning: a ledger recording payments to various officials, including Judge Hollister and the territorial mine inspector. But most interesting was a separate record of profit distributions, with Walter Randall's name at the top, receiving 60% of the proceeds. "This is it," he said, showing Margaret the ledger. "Direct evidence linking Randall to both the theft and the bribery. And if we can prove the connection between the safety violations and the deaths at the mine, we have him for criminal negligence as well." Margaret's eyes widened as she reviewed the figures. The scale of this. They've stolen nearly $500,000 in silver over 3 years. And these bribes. A noise at the door interrupted her. Frank motioned for silence, drawing his Colt as the door handle turned. They had nowhere to hide in the small office. Their only hope was surprise. The door swung open to reveal a burly man in a foreman's clothes who froze in shock at the sight of intruders. Before he could shout an alarm, Frank was on him, clamping one hand over the man's mouth while pressing the barrel of his revolver against his temple. Not a sound, Frank growled. Inside, nice and easy. He forced the foreman into the office, closing the door behind them. Margaret quickly tore a strip of cloth from her petticoat to gag the man, while Frank used the foreman's own belt to bind his hands. We need to move, now, Frank said, gathering the incriminating documents. They'll be looking for him soon. They secured the bound foreman to a chair and slipped back out through the window. But their luck had run out. A guard had spotted the movement and raised the alarm. Shouts echoed across the facility as men began pouring out of the cookhouse. Run, Frank ordered, firing a shot to provide cover as they sprinted for the canyon wall. Margaret clutched the precious documents to her chest as they ran, dodging between equipment and piles of ore. Bullets whistled past them, kicking up dirt at their feet. They reached the base of the ridge and began climbing desperately toward where Collins waited with the horses. Frank turned occasionally to fire back, not aiming to kill, but to discourage pursuit. They were halfway up the slope when a bullet found its mark, grazing Frank's left arm. He stumbled, but kept climbing, ignoring the burning pain and the warm flow of blood down his sleeve. Margaret glanced back, her face paling at the sight of his injury. But she pressed on as instructed. Finally, they reached the top, where Collins waited anxiously with the horses. "You're hit!" he exclaimed, as Frank swung himself painfully into the saddle. "Just a graze. We need to move. They'll be coming up after us." Frank winced as he took the reins. "Head for the old Miller place about 5 miles east. We can regroup there before returning to town." They rode hard, taking a winding path through the hills to throw off any pursuit. By the time they reached the abandoned Miller homestead, a small cabin that had been empty since the original settler had given up on farming the harsh land, Frank's sleeve was soaked with blood, and his face had taken on a grayish pallor. "Let me see that arm," Margaret insisted, as soon as they had secured the horses out of sight behind the cabin. Despite his protests, she helped him remove his jacket and rolled up his sleeve to reveal a deep furrow across his bicep. It was still bleeding freely. "It needs cleaning and bandaging," she declared, her voice brooking no argument. "Mr. Collins, please fetch water from the well. There should be a bucket somewhere." While Collins went in search of water, Margaret tore more strips from her petticoat to serve as bandages. "You're surprisingly well prepared for battlefield medicine, Miss Sinclair," Frank observed, trying to distract himself from the pain. A small smile touched her lips. "My father believed a lady should be practical as well as refined, and during the war, I volunteered in a military hospital in Boston. I've seen worse wounds than this, Marshal." When Collins returned with water, Margaret cleaned the wound with a gentleness that belied her efficiency. "It won't need stitches," she concluded, "but you've lost blood and there's risk of infection. We should get you to Dr. Wilson as soon as possible." Frank nodded, wincing as she bound the wound tightly with the improvised bandages. "First, we need a plan. Randall's men will be watching the roads back to town, and by now, they'll know exactly what we found at that facility." "Can we trust the federal marshal you telegraphed?" Collins asked. "Marshal Calloway is a good man. If my telegram reached him, he'll come. But it could take days, and we don't have days." Frank accepted a canteen from Collins and took a long drink. "Randall will be desperate now. He knows we have evidence that could send him to prison. He'll either try to flee or eliminate the threat, meaning us." Margaret's expression was resolute. "Then we need to reach town and make this evidence public before he can act. Once the townspeople know the truth, especially the miners who've been at risk, Randall will find himself without allies." Frank considered this strategy. It was risky, but might be their best option. "We'll wait until dark, then approach town from the north, avoiding the main roads. With luck, we can reach my office without being seen. From there, we can call a town meeting and present our findings. As they waited for nightfall, Frank found himself increasingly aware of Margaret's presence beside him. She had shown remarkable courage and competence throughout their ordeal, qualities he had learned to value above all others during his years on the frontier. The admiration he'd been feeling was deepening into something more, a connection he hadn't experienced in a very long time. "You're staring, Marshal," Margaret observed quietly, a hint of amusement in her voice. Collins had stepped outside to check on the horses, leaving them momentarily alone. Frank felt uncharacteristically self-conscious. "Forgive me? I was just thinking that you've proven yourself more than equal to the challenges of the West. Most Easterners I've known would have broken under half the strain you've endured." She smiled, the expression softening the determined set of her features. "My father used to say that character isn't built in comfort. Perhaps that's why he sent me to the war hospital instead of finishing school." She paused, studying him with those perceptive hazel eyes. "You've been alone in your role as protector of this town for a long time, haven't you, Marshal?" The question caught him off guard with its insight. "The nature of the job," he replied simply. "Hard to form attachments when you might have to arrest someone's husband or brother tomorrow." A lonely existence. I've never thought of it that way. But he had, of course. In the quiet hours of night when the town slept and he made his rounds, the weight of isolation had been his constant companion. And yet you continue, year after year. Why? Frank considered the question seriously. Because someone has to stand between the innocent and those who would prey on them. Because I gave my word to protect this town and its people. He met her gaze directly. The same reason you came west to investigate wrongdoing that others would have ignored from the comfort of Boston. Understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared purpose that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. In that moment, something shifted in their relationship, moving beyond the professional arrangement that had brought them together. The moment was interrupted by Collins's return. "No sign of pursuit yet," he reported, "but we should prepare to move once darkness falls." They spent the remaining hours reviewing the evidence they had gathered and planning their approach to town. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the abandoned homestead, Frank checked his weapon and prepared to lead their dangerous return to Redemption Creek. "Stay close and follow my lead," he instructed as they mounted their horses. "If we're separated, head directly for my office. And remember, Randall is desperate now. He'll have nothing left to lose." The night was clear, with a 3/4 moon providing enough light to navigate, but sufficient darkness for concealment. They took a circuitous route through the hills, avoiding the main trails and keeping to the shadows whenever possible. Frank's arm throbbed painfully, but the bleeding had stopped, and he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. They were within a mile of town when Frank spotted movement ahead. Riders stationed along the ridge, silhouetted against the night sky. "Randall's men," he whispered, signaling a halt. "They're watching the approaches to town." "Is there another way in?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Frank considered their options. "There's an old creek bed that runs behind the Chinese settlement. It's dry this time of year and leads almost to the edge of town. We can follow it in and approach my office from the east." With painstaking care, they backtracked and circled wide to reach the creek bed. Progress was slow in the darkness, but eventually, the scattered lights of Redemption Creek came into view. The town seemed unusually quiet for evening. No music drifted from the saloons, no shouts or laughter from the streets. "Something's wrong," Frank murmured as they tethered their horses behind the livery stable and proceeded on foot. Town's too quiet. They moved silently through the shadows, keeping to alleys and spaces between buildings. As they neared the main street, the reason for the unnatural silence became apparent. A crowd had gathered in the open area before the mine office, where Walter Randall stood on a raised platform, addressing the assembled townspeople. Dangerous criminals who have stolen company property and assaulted our employees. Randall's voice carried clearly in the still night air. Marshal Harlan has betrayed his oath of office by aiding these thieves. I am offering a $500 reward for their capture, alive or dead. Frank felt Margaret tense beside him. He's turned the town against us, she whispered incredulously. Not everyone, Frank replied, noticing that while some in the crowd nodded in agreement with Randall, others, particularly the miners and their families, looked skeptical. But we need to be careful. Let's get to my office and assess the situation. They skirted the gathering, using the darkness between buildings to remain undetected. Frank's office was dark and seemingly unguarded, a stroke of luck he hadn't dared hope for. He unlocked the door with practiced quiet, ushering Margaret and Collins inside before securing it behind them. Now what? Collins asked, his scholarly composure finally beginning to crack under the strain. The whole town's looking for us. Not the whole town, Frank corrected, moving to his desk and lighting a small lamp. Randall's trying to control the narrative, but he doesn't have everyone convinced. We still have the truth on our side, and the evidence to prove it. Margaret placed the documents they had retrieved on the desk. But how do we present this evidence when Randall has branded us criminals? We can't simply walk out there and call for attention. Frank was formulating a response when a soft knock came at the back door. His hand moved instantly to his revolver as he motioned for silence. Another knock, then a whispered voice. "Marshal, it's Sarah Hawkins. I know you're in there." Frank relaxed slightly, but remained cautious as he approached the door. Sarah Hawkins, owner of the Prairie Rose Saloon, had been his friend and confidant for years. But in a situation this volatile, trust was a luxury. "Just you?" he asked through the door. "Just me," she confirmed. "And information you need to hear." Frank opened the door just enough for Sarah to slip inside, then secured it again. She took in the scene with a quick glance. Frank's bloodied sleeve, Margaret's disheveled appearance, the documents spread across the desk. "You've got half the town looking for you," she said, without preamble. "Randall's told everyone you stole company documents and attacked his men at some property south of here. But the miners aren't buying it. There's been too much bad blood between them and Randall for too long." "What about the rest of the town?" Frank asked. Sarah's expression was grim. "Divided. Some believe Randall, especially those who do business with the mine. Others are reserving judgment, waiting to hear your side. Randall's deputized about a dozen men, mostly the rougher elements who frequent the Silver Dollar. They're searching the town as we speak." "We have evidence," Margaret interjected, stepping forward. "Documents proving Randall has been stealing from the company, bribing officials, and deliberately neglecting safety measures that caused men to die." Sarah studied her thoughtfully. "You must be Miss Sinclair. I'm Sarah Hawkins, owner of the Prairie Rose." "Miss Hawkins has been a friend to this town for many years," Frank explained. "If anyone can help us reach the miners with our evidence, it's her." Sarah nodded decisively. "The miners trust me. Many of them come to the Prairie Rose rather than the Silver Dollar because I run a fair establishment and don't water down the whiskey. If you can get your evidence to their leaders, they'll stand with you against Randall." "Who would those leaders be?" Margaret asked. "Thomas Byrne and Lee Wei," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Byrne speaks for the white miners, Wei for the Chinese. They don't advertise their positions for fear of Randall's retribution, but every miner knows to listen when they speak. Frank considered this information. Can you get them here without attracting attention? I can try. Burn should be at my place now. He usually takes his evening meal there. Wei will be more difficult. He rarely leaves the Chinese settlement after dark. Sarah glanced at the window. Give me 30 minutes, and be ready to move if necessary. Randall's men will eventually think to check here. After Sarah departed, Frank, Margaret, and Collins worked quickly to organize their evidence and prepare a concise presentation of Randall's crimes. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness, each sound from outside causing them to tense in anticipation of discovery. Finally, another soft knock came at the back door. This time, Sarah was accompanied by a burly, red-bearded man with calloused hands and a permanently furrowed brow. Thomas Byrne, Frank presumed, and a slender Chinese man in Western clothes who moved with quiet dignity. Thomas Byrne, Li Wei, Sarah introduced quickly. This is Marshal Harlan, whom you know, Miss Sinclair, and Mr. Collins. Byrne wasted no time with pleasantries. Sarah says you have proof Randall's been stealing from the company and risking our lives to line his pockets. Is that true? See for yourself, Margaret replied, spreading the documents on the desk. Financial records from a secret processing facility showing silver shipments that were never reported to the company. Ledgers documenting bribes to officials who should have been enforcing safety regulations. And here, she pointed to a particular document, direct evidence that Randall ordered the use of substandard support timbers in the section that collapsed last November, killing 3 of your fellow miners. Byrne's face darkened with anger as he examined the evidence. McPherson, Sullivan, and Chen, good men, all of them, left wives and children behind. He turned to Wei. Your cousin was one of them, wasn't he? Wei nodded, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes burning with a cold rage as he studied the documents. Chen Jian. He left 4 children. The company compensation was inadequate because Randall pocketed most of what should have been paid, Margaret explained, pointing to another entry in the ledger. The company allocated substantial funds for death benefits, but only a fraction was ever distributed to the families. What do you need from us? Byrne asked directly. Frank stepped forward. Your men trust you. We need you to gather them, as many as possible, at the mine entrance at dawn. Miss Sinclair will present this evidence, not just to the miners, but to the entire town. Once the truth is known, Randall's support will crumble. Wei spoke for the first time, his English precise and deliberate. Randall's men are armed and desperate. They will not surrender power easily. That's why we need numbers, Frank explained. 400 miners standing together are a force that Randall's dozen thugs can't oppose. And by tomorrow afternoon, the federal marshal should arrive from Denver with official authority to arrest Randall and his conspirators. Byrne and Wei exchanged a look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Byrne nodded. We'll do it. Every miner in Redemption Creek will know the truth by morning, and they'll be at the mine entrance at dawn. But you'll need to get there safely first. I have a plan for that, Sarah interjected. My delivery wagon makes an early morning run to restock the saloon. You can hide in the back under the supply crates. No one questions my wagon, even in these circumstances. The plan set, Byrne and Wei departed to spread the word among the miners, moving carefully to avoid Randall's patrols. Sarah followed shortly after, promising to return before dawn with the wagon. Left alone again, Frank, Margaret, and Collins took turns keeping watch while the others rested. Frank found sleep elusive despite his exhaustion, his mind racing with contingency plans and the weight of what morning would bring. The confrontation with Randall would be dangerous, perhaps the most dangerous situation he had faced in his years as marshal. But it wasn't fear that kept him awake. It was the awareness that after tomorrow, whatever the outcome, his relationship with Margaret Sinclair would change irrevocably. If they succeeded, she would return to her life in Boston, to the world of business and society that was her birthright. And he would remain in Redemption Creek, or perhaps move on to another frontier town in need of a lawman. Their paths, which had crossed so unexpectedly, would diverge once more. The thought brought an unexpected ache. In the short time since her arrival, Margaret had awakened something in him that had lain dormant for years. Not just admiration or attraction, but a recognition of a kindred spirit. Someone who understood the burden of responsibility and the lonely path of principle. As if sensing his thoughts, Margaret stirred from her light sleep and moved to sit beside him at the window. For a moment, they watched the quiet street together, the moon casting silver light on the weathered buildings of Redemption Creek. "What will you do?" she asked softly, "after Randall is brought to justice?" The question echoed his own thoughts so precisely that Frank almost smiled. "Continue as marshal, I suppose. This town will need stability in the aftermath. And you? Back to Boston?" She was silent for a long moment, her profile limned in moonlight. "That was the plan," she admitted. "Return to Boston, implement reforms in the company, resume my life there." She turned to face him. "But I'm finding that prospect less appealing than I once did." "The West has a way of changing perspectives," Frank offered, not daring to interpret her meaning more personally. A small smile touched her lips. "It's not just the West, Marshal Harlan. It's the people one meets here. People of principle and courage. People who stand for something more than profit or position." Her eyes held his. "People like you." The air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Frank found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, the faint scent of lavender that somehow persisted despite their ordeal, the quiet strength in her posture, the intelligence and determination in her gaze. "Margaret," he said, using her given name for the first time, "when this is over—" A sudden commotion in the street interrupted him. They both turned to the window to see a group of Randall's men approaching the marshal's office, led by the mine manager himself. They had been found. "Collins," Frank called urgently, rousing the engineer from his sleep. "They're here. We need to move. Now." They gathered the evidence quickly, Margaret tucking the most crucial documents into her bodice while Frank checked his revolver. The back door was their only option, but even as they moved toward it, the sound of boots on the rear porch told them that route was blocked as well. "The cells," Frank decided, leading them to the back of the office where two holding cells stood. He unlocked one quickly. "Inside, both of you. They'll search here first, but they won't expect you to be locked in a cell. I'll try to lead them away." "No," Margaret protested. "You're injured, and there are too many of them." "I know this town better than they do," Frank assured her. "I can evade them until dawn. Just stay hidden, no matter what you hear. Sarah will come with the wagon, as planned." Before Margaret could object further, a pounding came at the front door, followed by Randall's voice. "Marshal Harlan, we know you're in there. Come out now, or we're coming in." "Go," Frank urged, securing the cell door once Margaret and Collins were inside. He passed his spare revolver to Margaret through the bars. "Only if absolutely necessary," he cautioned. She took the weapon with a steady hand, her eyes never leaving his. "Be careful, Frank. We have unfinished business." The intimacy of his first name on her lips gave him pause. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, acknowledgement of something deeper than their professional alliance passing between them. Then Frank moved to the front of the office, took a deep breath, and flung open the door, firing 2 shots into the air that sent Randall's men diving for cover. In the confusion, he darted into the street and disappeared into the darkness between buildings, drawing the pursuit away from where Margaret and Collins hid. The night became a deadly game of cat and mouse through the streets and alleys of Redemption Creek. Frank used every trick he had learned in his years as a scout and lawman, doubling back, creating false trails, using the town's terrain to his advantage. His wounded arm throbbed with renewed pain, but he pushed through it, focused solely on keeping Randall's men occupied until dawn. He caught glimpses of other movement in the shadows, townspeople watching from windows, miners moving stealthily toward gathering points, Chinese workers slipping through back alleys with purposeful determination. Word was spreading, and the town was awakening to the truth about Walter Randall. As the first hint of dawn colored the eastern sky, Frank found himself cornered in the stable behind the Silverado Hotel. 3 of Randall's men had him pinned down, and he was down to his last few rounds of ammunition. He had led them on a chase across half the town, but now his options were running out. A noise at the stable door drew the attention of his pursuers. It swung open to reveal Sarah Hawkins, seemingly surprised to encounter armed men. "Well, gentlemen," she said coolly, recovering quickly. "Unusual place for a gathering at this hour." Her distraction was all Frank needed. He fired his remaining shots, not aiming to kill, but to drive the men back. Then rushed past Sarah into the alley where her delivery wagon waited, Thomas Byrne at the reins. "The others?" Frank asked urgently as they pulled away, bullets splintering the wood of the wagon behind them. "Already collected and safe," Sarah assured him. "We're heading to the mine entrance now. Every miner in town will be there, plus most of the townspeople. Even the Chinese are coming, which has never happened before." Frank allowed himself a moment of relief. The plan was working. The people of Redemption Creek were rallying to the truth. But the most dangerous moment still lay ahead. Randall wouldn't surrender his power without a fight. The sun was breaking over the eastern mountains as Sarah's wagon approached the mine entrance. Frank was astonished by the scene that greeted them. Hundreds of people had gathered, miners still in their work clothes, townspeople in various states of dress. The Chinese workers standing somewhat apart, but clearly part of the assembly. All waited in tense anticipation. At the far end of the gathering, Walter Randall and about 20 armed men formed a defensive line before the mine office, their expressions a mixture of anger, fear, and defiance. Randall himself stood at the center, a rifle in his hands, watching the approaching wagon with naked hatred. Sarah brought the wagon to a stop, and Frank helped Margaret and Collins down from their hiding place among the supply crates. A murmur went through the crowd as they appeared, some expressions hostile, others hopeful, most simply curious to hear what would unfold. Frank scanned the assembly, noting with satisfaction that many of the townspeople he had protected over the years stood ready to support him. Doc Wilson was there, and Elijah the barber, and dozens of others whose daily lives had been touched by his even-handed justice. Even Judge Hollister stood at the edge of the crowd, looking uncomfortable but present, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing. Margaret stepped forward, her bearing regal despite her disheveled appearance after the night's ordeal. The crowd quieted as she raised her voice to address them. "People of Redemption Creek," she began, her clear tones carrying across the open space. I am Margaret Sinclair, daughter of Calvin Sinclair and current owner of the Redemption Creek Mining Company. I came here to investigate rumors of corruption and negligence at this mine. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. She produced the documents they had risked so much to obtain. I have here irrefutable proof that Walter Randall and his associates have been systematically stealing from both the company and from you, the people who make this mine productive. They have diverted silver ore to a secret processing facility and sold it for their personal profit. They have bribed officials to overlook dangerous conditions that have resulted in death and injury to your fellow workers, and they have pocketed money meant as compensation for the families of those who died in preventable accidents. An angry murmur rippled through the crowd, particularly among the miners. Thomas Burns stepped forward to stand beside Margaret, his presence a silent endorsement of her words. Li Wei joined them, representing the Chinese workers who had suffered equally under Randall's regime. "These are lies," Randall shouted from his position by the office. "Miss Sinclair is trying to take control of the mine to shut it down and throw you all out of work. She's an Eastern elitist who knows nothing about mining or the West." "If these are lies, Mr. Randall," Margaret countered, holding up the ledger, "then how do you explain this record of payments to Judge Hollister and Inspector Williams? How do you explain the shipping manifests for silver that never appeared in company accounts? How do you explain your own signature on orders to use substandard support timbers in the very section where men died last November?" The crowd's anger was palpable now, directed squarely at Randall and his men. Several of the miners surged forward, their patience exhausted by years of exploitation. Randall, seeing his control slipping away, raised his rifle and aimed directly at Margaret. "Stay back, or she dies." Frank moved with the reflexes honed by decades on the frontier, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. His bullet struck Randall's shoulder, sending the rifle clattering to the ground. The mine manager fell to his knees, clutching his wound as his men, witnessing their leader's defeat, lowered their weapons. The federal marshal arrived with his deputies an hour later to find Randall and his conspirators already in custody. The townspeople united in their determination to see justice done. The evidence was overwhelming, and within days, formal charges were filed against Randall for theft, fraud, bribery, and criminal negligence, resulting in death. 2 weeks later, Frank stood on the porch of his office, watching as workers made repairs to the mine under new, safer guidelines established by Margaret. She approached him, no longer the Eastern lady who had arrived in Redemption Creek, but a woman transformed by her experiences in the West. "The company board has asked me to remain as the mine's director," she said, her hazel eyes meeting his directly. "I've accepted." Frank felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. "Hope. Redemption Creek will be better for it," he replied softly. Margaret smiled, stepping closer. "I hired you for safety, Marshal Harlan, never expecting my heart would be the one in danger." "Some dangers," Frank said as he took her hand in his, "are worth facing head-on." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the town they had both fought to protect, Frank and Margaret stood together on the threshold of a new beginning, proof that even in the harsh reality of the frontier, love could flourish in the most unexpected places. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.